freedom. It's about breaking free and living free. And those two things are different. Breaking free and living free are two different things. You can't live free without breaking free, but it is possible to break free without living free. And that's a lot of the struggle that Israel faced in their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. And we're going to look at all of that, not in near the detail that we did in the book of Genesis. We'll just spend probably a couple of months, maybe 3 months in Exodus, and then move on after that. But we're gonna look at that struggle, look at that process, and see what it has to say to us today and how we're living our lives as followers of Jesus today. We're going to start this whole thing where the book starts, which is Israel's enslavement. You know, how did they become enslaved? Why did they become enslaved? Whose fault was it that they were enslaved? And what's God's response to all of that? So before we get into that in detail for Israel, for whatever reason, I turned the remote control off when I came up here rather than leaving it on. I don't know why I did that, but I did. So we're going to talk about slavery for just a little minute, because we got to acknowledge some realities in this. The book of Exodus was written about a group of people who were physically, bodily enslaved to other people. They were property. Their lives were controlled from the outside in. They were forced to work. They were forced to, it was demanded of them that they kill their firstborn sons to help stop or not their firstborn sons, any sons that were born, to help stop their population growth, or at least slow it. They were treated brutally. They were treated ruthlessly. They did not have the capacity or the freedom to leave, to save themselves. The power of Egypt was far greater than their power was. They were human property, chattel. And that's who this book was written about specifically. And none of us have that as our life experience. None of us really know what that kind of life is like. Now, there are people in American history that do know what that kind of life was like. The African slaves and then African American slaves that were in this country in the colonial days and then up through the early parts of this nation certainly understood that. They were property as well and treated brutally and ruthlessly and had little to no control over their own bodies. They also did not have the power or the ability to free themselves to simply walk away from it. It was beyond their capacity. None of those folks are still alive, though. There's no one alive now that was a chattel slave in the early American South or anywhere in America, early American anywhere. I'm saying this because we got to acknowledge those realities that we don't know and can't even really fully imagine what life was like for the Israelites or even for the slaves in America, even though they're much closer to us in time. That doesn't mean this book has nothing to say to us. There are lots of different ways of being enslaved. And we're going to talk about some of those other ways this morning that are as real, but they are different. And I want to acknowledge that difference because I don't want to inflate two different realities, and I don't want us to imagine that somehow we know what the Israelites were going through any more than we knew what the Africans and African Americans were going through in slavery in the United States. We can read about it, we can learn about it, but we'll never fully understand it because we haven't lived it and experienced it. But Exodus is still relevant to us because there are, as I said, there are lots of ways of being enslaved. Social media, phone, tablet, computer. A lot of folks enslaved to that. Can't put it down, can't put the phone down, can't turn the computer off, can't put the tablet down. Watching video after video, post after post, reading this, reading that. Emotions dominated and controlled by what we experience online, and some people are enslaved to that. And we're going to come back to these things a little bit later. I'm just going to mention them now. We live in a highly sexualized culture where sex is really everywhere. And it's not surprising that in a highly sexualized culture that we see an increasing amount of compulsive sexual behavior in people, people enslaved to certain types of sexual behaviors. Alcohol and other drugs, very prevalent, very accessible, very readily accessible now, both the illegal and the legal sort, and a lot of people enslaved to those. You don't have to spend long with an active addict to know that that person's a slave, that they can't just stop, they can't just turn it off, and that's the most important thing in their life. Modern highly processed foods are very addictive, and people can become enslaved to that. Obesity is a problem now, not just in the United States, but in many parts of the world, including Europe, in a way that it never used to be until our modern ways of processing and delivering and consuming food. And it enslaves people. Gambling, far more accessible today than it has ever been, at least in my lifetime. It's on your phone, it's on your computer, it's on your tablet, it's in the Walmart, it's at the gas station, it's wherever you want to go. You can gamble on just about anything. There are sites now online where you can gamble on how different political votes will go. I don't know how that's legal, but it's legal. I think it's legal anyway. I've heard about it. So, but gambling, people get addicted to that rush. That maybe the next one will be the big win. Maybe I'll finally score a big one. Maybe it'll be great. And there's this rush and there's this adrenaline, and people get addicted to it. Looks maxing. I got to tell you, when I used that word at Chester this morning, the teenagers cringed when I said looks maxing. But looks maxing's a real thing too. And started off being a term being applied to men. Now, apparently, men and women engage in this sort of thing. And in fact, it's not a new thing. It's just a new name for an old thing, which is people driven by unrealistic cultural expectations about beauty and appearance will do anything and everything that they possibly can to make their bodies fit those expectations, including some pretty radical kinds of surgeries to change bone and facial structure and things like that. People get addicted to that I have to look like people expect me to look. I got to look good. I got to look the way everyone thinks good looks. And if I don't, there's something wrong with me. Advertising, including for goods, for services, and for politics. Everyone knows advertising sways people. Everyone is convinced it only sways other people. Not me. Advertising doesn't affect me. This is not true. Advertising affects all of us. It really does. If it didn't, companies and politicians would not spend billions of dollars every year on advertising. They do that because it works. It influences people. It affects people. And people can become enslaved to the messages that they receive through, ads of any and all sorts. Ideological echo chambers can be addictive, enslaving. We get so firmly fixed in our various ideological beliefs, whether it's political, economic, or religious, moral, social, whatever it is, that we only want to hear what agrees with us. And we listen to what agrees with us. And that makes us feel good. It makes us feel confident. It makes us feel righteous. And if we hear disagreeing voices, that makes us anxious and angry and upset. And we don't want to hear that. It leads to sleepless nights and worry and all sorts of trouble and distress. So we keep the dissenting voices away and listen to the agreeing voices. And we become enslaved to these echo chambers where we only hear the things that we already believe and already agree with. Lifestyle, envy, greed, ambition. Got to have the right car, got to have the right house, got to have the right job, got to have the right amount of money, got to have the right clothes, got to have the right shoes, got to have the right backpack for school, got to have the right, all of these things that just takes money. It just takes money and more money and more money and more money. And again, it's a big perception thing that I want to be seen as doing well as the folks down the street or better than the folks down the street. Or at least, I want to see perceived as being successful. And greed, ambition enslave us. Debt. I have no scientific basis for saying this. This is just my gut instinct. I would say debt is probably the biggest slave master in the world in the present day. Debt enslaves individuals. Debt enslaves families. Debt enslaves communities. Debt enslaves nations. There are nations in this world. I'm not talking about the United States right now. We've got a massive amount of debt. We at least have the theoretical possibility of perhaps one day paying off the debt. We make a lot of money in the United States. But there are nations in this world that have become indebted and will never be free from that debt, barring some external force intervening to help them be free. And they have lost control of their own futures and their own destinies because of debt. Debt enslaves. Gaming can enslave. Gaming can be as addictive as any other form of media and entertainment. And the point where we have to do it, we need to do it. We don't feel right if we're not doing it. And we got to do it. Even if I have to sacrifice time with family, with friends, with God, and these other things, I got to do my gaming. Gaming can enslave us. Sex trafficking is a much more literal kind of slavery that is very real and very prevalent in this world. And the United States is one of, if not the biggest, it's one of the biggest destinations for girls, boys, women, men who are being sex trafficked. Toledo is one of the biggest points of entry in the world for sex trafficking into a country. Little old Toledo, Ohio. I don't know why they picked Toledo. I don't know how Toledo got that rather dubious honor, but they've got it. It's real. There are all sorts of ways that we can be enslaved beyond that basic form of the chattel slavery that existed in Egypt and used to exist in the United States. And that's why Exodus is as relevant for us as it is for the Israelites in their day and for the slaves in early America, because they found great comfort and strength and hope in the story of the Exodus. Hope for freedom, that they would one day receive freedom as well at the hand of God. And of course, we are all slaves to sin. Now, some of those things I had on the previous list could be easily categorized as sin, but certainly not all of those things. There were many things on there that are just neutral in and of themselves, but can still enslave us. But we're all born slaves to sin. That's why Jesus needed to come, why he chose to come, why he lived, why he died on the cross, to set us free, to break us free from slavery to sin so we could live free from slavery to sin. So this is a reality for all of us. It's not the same kind of reality. Each has its own different quirks and individualities, but they're all forms and ways and means of enslavement. The Exodus then is for us a foundational story of God's people enslaved and God's response to his people's enslavement. God's people are enslaved. How does God respond? That may be, there are two sides to this coin. How does God respond to people's enslavement? And how do God's people respond to God's response to their enslavement? Today we're really looking at that God's response. God's response, key thing here. It's easy to overlook. It's because it's never explicitly said. But Israel is never blamed for their enslavement. Ever. Now, there are places in the Old Testament where bad things happen to the Israelites. And the prophets, God through the prophets tells them, bad things are happening to you because you did bad things. You did dumb things. You did stupid things. And you are reaping the consequences of that. When it comes to their enslavement in Egypt, the Bible, God never blames Israel for their enslavement. And God could have. God could have said, hey, you guys are embarrassing me. Why didn't you fight this? Why didn't you resist this? Why didn't you get out of this? Didn't you trust me enough to fight back against these people that are enslaving you? Why didn't you just pray to me? Why didn't you call on me? None of that. None of that. The Israelites are never blamed for their enslavement. Well, if it's not the Israelites' fault, if they weren't to blame for their enslavement, how did it happen? We're going to look at that. We're going to go back to some of the verses that John already read here today. Actually, John didn't read these. So we're reading some new verses. Or did you? I don't know. I can't remember. You did read them? Okay. All right. There's a verse later on. That's the one that's different. A new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. That's the first part. A new king who did not know about Joseph. The Egyptians, from their king down, forgot their history. They forgot about Joseph. They forgot what Joseph had done for them. That Joseph, this Hebrew, this child of Israel, an Israelite himself, had saved their entire nation from destitution and starvation during the famine years. They forgot that they owed him a great debt of gratitude. They owed him honor. They owed him respect. They owed him dignity. They forgot all about it. They forgot that when the Pharaoh that assigned Joseph to his place of second in command of Egypt, when that Pharaoh learned that Joseph's family was in danger from the famine, he insisted that they all come and live in Egypt, that the Israelites were invited to Egypt, and that they didn't take anything, they were given the land of Goshen, some of the most fruitful land in the entire country, as a gift in honor of what Joseph had done. Honor and shame are extraordinarily important principles in that part of the world in this day and age. They still are in that part of the world. But in that day and age, they were also extraordinarily important. And when a person does something that saves an entire nation, you honor them, you honor their whole family in gratitude. And they forgot that. They forgot that they owed honor and gratitude to the Israelites. The Israelites had prospered while they were there. They had grown phenomenally while they were there. But because the Egyptians forgot their history, instead of honoring them, they looked on them with suspicion and mistrust. Let's read on. Pharaoh says, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them." We'll come back to the shrewdly. "Otherwise, they will multiply further. When war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." If they'd remembered their history, they would have remembered to honor them. Instead, they looked at them with suspicion and mistrust and fear and responded to them according to that. Now, we're not told that the Israelites ever did anything to earn this suspicion, mistrust, and fear. In fact, the Israelites prospered. The Israelites were clearly good for the country of Egypt because they didn't want them to leave, right? They could have just, if they were troublemakers, they could have just kicked them out or killed them. They didn't want them to leave. They just wanted to control them. They wanted to dominate them. They wanted to enslave them because they didn't trust them. They feared them when there was no reason to. Joseph had been a blessing to them. The Israelites had already saved them. And they didn't have the Bible, so we can't, blame them for not knowing what the Bible says. But we know that God had already promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, "Your descendants will be as numerous as the sand on the seashore, and they will be a blessing to every nation on the earth. I will bless every nation in the earth through them." The Israelites were a blessing to Egypt, but they couldn't see it. And instead, they looked at them with fear, suspicion, and mistrust, accusing them of betrayal that they had never committed, and they enslaved them for it. Interesting historical tidbit. Two interesting historical tidbits. I don't have scientific evidence for this, but you could certainly make the contention that Israelites, the Jewish people, are historically the most persecuted people in history, if for no other reason that they have been around and have been persecuted off and on for 5,000 years. I mean, when you go back to Egypt, that's a long time. And there are very few other people groups that have that kind of continuous existence and ongoing periods of persecution. Here's another thing, and that people that have studied this have looked at it and documented. Every nation in history that has welcomed and received Jewish people has prospered during the years that they welcomed and received Jewish people. It's not because Jews are magic. It's not because they're lucky charms. It's because God keeps his promises. And God says, "I'll bless every nation in the world through the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And they had that. Now, that's in the Bible. The Egyptians didn't have the Bible. The Bible had not been written yet. So they would not have known that. But they had within their borders a source of great divine blessing. And they failed to receive it. Instead, they dealt with them shrewdly. That word shrewd is interesting. It carries the connotations of wisely and skillfully, but with a negative sense. Think about scammers. I've been seeing videos online recently of online scammers, people that they call up, they use emails, texts, a variety of ways to get you to call them, and they are incredibly skillful. They're skillful on the computer, and they're skillful on exactly what to say to their targets to get them to give access to their computers so they can install software, so they can steal their identity, steal their money, do all these different kinds of things. That's shrewdness. These scammers that are out there, they know their business, they know their targets, they know their people, and they know their computers, and they know how to get around everything they need to get around to do what they need to do, even though it's illegal even in the countries where they're doing it from, whether that's the United States or other countries. Shrewdly. They're shrewd about it, and we're going to get into that in a little more depth with it. But this business of the king, there was a force around them that was greater than they were, that dealt with them shrewdly to intentionally bring them into a position of slavery. We don't know the specific steps along the way. We're not told, so apparently it doesn't really matter what the specific steps were along the way for us to know. We needed to know it. The Bible would have told us. But they went from being a free, prosperous people to ending in slavery, where they were being ordered to kill their sons. And that didn't happen overnight. That was a process. The king dealt with them shrewdly and led them little by little into a position where they were enslaved. So what does this have to do with us? Well, we've got to start with this reminder again. Israel was never blamed for their enslavement. They were never blamed for their enslavement. So given all of that, let's take another look at these present-day enslavements. It's not the exact same list. For whatever reason, I decided to reformat it. I thought it would help, but I'm not sure it helps. But we'll see. There are slaves alive today. People bodily enslaved, like African Americans were enslaved here, like the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt. Countries don't shout about it. They don't keep, detailed records of it, or at least they don't share it, because it's frowned upon. But it happens. And so it's difficult. The most recent number I read, which I found this past week, is 26 million slaves in the world today. And one of the places that people get enslaved is in Qatar, in the Middle East, and there's some other, not all, but some of the Muslim countries in the Middle East engage in slavery. But what they do is they're shrewd. They advertise in desperately poor countries and neighborhoods in Africa and Southeast Asia. And they promise jobs for reasonable pay, like $400 or $500 a month, which might not be a lot to us, but is a whole lot to them. And people come to get those jobs, and they arrive to their employers, who become their masters, because their employers then take their passports and never let them leave. They're told they'll be able to send money back to their families, but they're not given money to send back to their families. They're just kept as slaves. Saw a report recently, a woman, African-American woman, traveling in Qatar. She was in the airport, and there was a line for domestic, there was a line for another, there was this other line that was all black women that were huddled together talking amongst themselves. And she asked her traveling companion, "Who are those?" And their traveling companion says, "Oh, they're slaves." Didn't bat an eye, didn't blink, not chagrined. It was just everyone there knew it. They were slaves. And they were all okay with that. Now, the woman sharing this message out was not okay with that, was horrified by that. But it's real. We don't, or we shouldn't, we cannot legitimately blame those desperately poor folks from Africa and Southeast Asia because they became enslaved, because they were promised something that they thought would be good and turned out to be hell. They were dealt with shrewdly. Boys and girls groomed and forced into sex trafficking in many countries, including the United States. We can't blame them. Groomers are very good at their job. They're very good at the work that they do. They know what to say. They know how to say it. They know how to separate kids. They know how to get them alone. They know how to gain trust. They know how to separate them from the people that might help them and care for them. They're dealt with shrewdly. And when someone finds themselves, or we encounter someone that has been enslaved in that way, we could, but we shouldn't. And we can't legitimately blame them for being enslaved. Those enticed into highly processed foods, alcohol, drugs, gambling. We'll stick with the foods. Alcohol and gambling and drugs. get talked about a lot of times, a lot of ways. Here's an interesting story. I find this an interesting story. It's a horrifying story, but I find it so interesting that I smile when I tell the story, and it's not appropriate for me to smile, but I will anyway because I find it fascinating. Rats. Does anyone here keep rats as a pet? You do? You have? Okay. Nothing I am saying is to condemn rats as pets. I just want to say that. Most people view rats as vermin. Just going to say that. Most people do. Some people keep them as pets. That's cool. I've had hamsters. Hamsters in the wild would be considered vermin too. But, rats are considered vermin by most people. Rats will eat a lot of different stuff, right? And rats in the wild eating their natural food, even when they have an abundance, a surplus of food, rats do not overeat. They don't become obese. They just don't do it. They eat until they're full, and then even if they're surrounded by food, they stop eating. Now, some people smarter than me got some rats and did an experiment. And instead of feeding the rats natural food that rats eat, they fed them people food. Stuff, ordinary stuff that we eat on a regular basis. It was high in fat, it was high in salt, and it was high in sugar. And those rats ate and ate and ate and ate until they became obese. Why? Because the people that designed that food are very shrewd. And they work for companies that want to sell food. And the more food they sell, the more money they make. And they know that the more food we eat, the more food we buy. And so they design foods that diminish our sense of fullness so that we can, even if we've eaten enough, we don't feel full, or our fullness drive is overridden by just how palatable, how tasty the food is. It's so good. It's just, I am caught up in this, right? I bought a bag of Dandy cheese puffs, the big bag, at Piggly Wiggly and Gallipolis on Friday. That's my shopping day. I was like, I'm going to make this bag last all week. There's that much left. I just stand there in the kitchen and eat it by the handful. Oh, it's good. Dandy cheese puffs. The food is designed for that. That's not an accident. It's intentional. And so when we see people that are enslaved to food to the point of eating in ways that make their own bodies unhealthy, we can't blame them and judge them and condemn them any more than we do these other folks. Those enticed into lifestyles driven by envy and dependent on greed, ambition, and acquisitiveness. Again, everything in our country and our economy pushes people to buy more and more and more and more. Our economy is built on convincing people to spend money they don't have to buy things they don't need. It's the basis for our economy. And as much as we all like to think we're not affected by those influences, we are. We are. And when we see people that are driven to get more and more and more and more and more, they become enslaved by forces that behave with an incredible amount of savvy and shrewdness to get people to think and believe certain things that will lead them to behave in certain ways that include envy, ambition, and greed, acquiring more and more and more. Those groomed into looks maxing, eating disorders. People that think they have to look, as if they're going to be valuable as a human being, I have to meet society's definition of what beautiful is, of what handsome is. I have to get that. If I'm not that, I've got to do whatever I have to my body to get there, whether it's starving myself, whether it's radical surgeries, whatever it is, I've got to do that. Those folks have been groomed into a way of thinking that has enslaved them by people who know what they're doing and are doing it intentionally. People dealing with them shrewdly. Those hooked on TV, movies, gaming, social media, same deal. The people that design the algorithms for TikTok and Facebook Reels and YouTube Shorts and all of these things, Instagram Reels, they know what they're doing. They know just how long the videos should be. They know just the right content to feed. They know. They deal with us shrewdly. It's all intentional to keep people looking at the screen. TV is changing. Netflix has seen this. They're good at what they do. They know that people's attention spans are shorter, and if you don't hook them in the first 4 minutes, they will switch to something else. And so Netflix now has a rule on their original programming. If you're doing original programming for Netflix, most folks then are required to put in the first 3 minutes a hook, which is so if it's a murder mystery, then the murder, which might not happen for 34 minutes, they show the murder in the first 3 minutes, or the crime scene. And then they spend the next 30 minutes working back to that point in time, because they got to get you hooked right at the beginning. They've learned that to keep you focused and watching. These folks out there get paid a lot of money to know how to do these things. They're very good at their jobs. So can we look at them? And let's be honest, at us, because we're them. Can we look at them? Can we look at us without blame and with compassion? In other words, can we look at them and look at us like God does? This is how God looked at Israel and their sin. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and with honey. God saw his people enslaved. He didn't judge them. He didn't condemn them. He didn't tell them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. He didn't say just exercise some willpower. He didn't say get yourself out of this mess. He didn't say you made your bed, now you got to lie in it. He didn't say this is your fault. You deserve, this is it. He didn't say you're reaping what you're sowing. He said, my heart is breaking in compassion for my people. I will go set them free. That is God's response to his people enslaved. Not to blame, not to judge, not to condemn, but simply to have compassion. I believe this is the invitation that God puts before us too. To view those around us and ourselves when we are enslaved, to view them and us with compassion, not with judgment, not with blame, not with condemnation, but with compassion. And then, as we are able, to step in and help them break free. This is what Jesus did. God saw the whole world enslaved to sin. And he didn't blame the world. He didn't condemn the world. He didn't judge the world. He didn't send fire and brimstone on the world. He came to us as one of us, not to condemn the world, but that the world through Jesus might be saved. That's the gift of God. That's the life that God lives. That's the way God responds to people enslaved. And the way he invites us to respond to people enslaved and to ourselves when we find ourselves enslaved with compassion. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.